Hello, everyone. My name is Laura Baskall-Smith, and I'm so excited to be here, even if it's virtual, presenting on childhood apraxia of speech for you all. So let's get started. Thanks for having me. So I was asked by Julianne to speak today regarding identifying the correct path for intervention in CAS, in childhood apraxia of speech, from a parent and a professional perspective. So, learning objectives then today will hopefully be to identify the correct path, be able to list research based approaches for childhood apraxia speech, describe how therapy for childhood apraxia speech differs from other treatment approaches, and explain how to develop appropriate therapy targets for CAS. A little bit about me, if you don't know me. My background, I actually started as an SLPA, which is an assistant to a speech language pathologist, before becoming a speech language pathologist. I worked as an SLP before my daughter Ashlyn was born and subsequently diagnosed with CAS. And after Ashlyn's apraxia diagnosis, I transitioned into private practice, specializing in childhood apraxia speech, thanks a great in part to I attended the uh, childhood. I attended Apraxia Boot Camp, sponsored by Apraxia, now known as Apraxia Kids. And a fun fact to Steckel, who Dr. Steckel, who you listened to today, is my mentor. So I also run a uh, you can also find me on social media, where I became very passionate about spreading apraxia awareness after my daughter was diagnosed, based in part on so many things, but just the lack of information that was out there, lack of SLPs who were properly trained in this. And so I am very passionate about spreading praxia awareness, and you can find me on social media. And so one thing I like to do is not only talk about just, apraxia, but also just my personal experience being a speech language pathologist and mom to someone who has apraxia. And so this kind of summed it up recently. This is from a book I wrote called Overcoming Apraxia. And in it, I said, before I had a child with a speech delay or disorder, I could never have imagined how important time is to a parent. You don't want your child to spend one more minute trapped inside a mouth that isn't working. And so that really is how I felt. Time was of the essence, and you feel this internal motivation just to, or you feel this rush to, you know, get your child the services that they need. So I think that if I could help one person, that's what I wanted to do, because unfortunately, a lot of times parents have to be the one to, figure this out for their child. So anyway, so let's get into it. Where do I start? This is a common question that I'm asked from not only parents, but speech language pathologists. So where we start is we must be incorporating the principles of motor learning into whatever approach is utilized. And if you haven't heard, or at this conference, you were very fortunate to hear Dr. Edwin Moss give you a speech on the principles of motor learning. And so those are what are really going to drive therapy. Um, Approaches themselves may vary. So I have another slide where I'll show you the different approaches. But it's really important, if I could stress to you one thing, it's so important to know that there is not one best approach to use with an individual with childhood apraxia of speech. So, and it's also important, what's important is that the child will make progress. So what's important is that the child is making progress and that they will make progress. And it's also important to note that approaches may and should change and be modified as the child makes progress. So I see a lot of parents or even speech language pathologists kind of sticking to one approach, but a lot of times the child has grown out of that approach, and it needs to be modified or changed most of the time. So I could tell you a personal story for me, just in terms of my own daughter, who's now 10 and has resolving apraxia. When she was younger, I found a therapist who specialized in childhood apraxia speech, and they used what is known as the Kaufman method. So I think you guys are familiar with Nancy, which is known as the Kaufman method. And this really, I'm going to show you this slide really fast because, yeah, we're going to go. So it's also important to note that the approach will need to be modified as the child makes progress. So a lot of times parents get stuck on, my child only made progress with prompt. I need to have prompt, prompt, prompt. And even when the child is kind of moved past what prompt may or may not offer, people can get very stuck in that same approach when the approach actually needs to be changed. So that's kind of a perfect segue into, so we can say, okay. So that really gets us into the best approaches for CAS. So this graphic is taken from an article written by Dr. McCabe and colleagues in Australia, and they did a database aggregate of what the best available evidence says um, for regarding approaches for childhood apraxia speech. And so in the green light boxes, these are what best, these approaches have the highest evidence for them currently in the literature. And in yellow light, they have, moderate evidence, but you need to approach, it's kind of like buyer beware, approach this with caution, for the yellow lights. So a lot of people are surprised that very popular approaches such as prompt and Kaufman are found in the yellow light boxes. And, that's not to say that they're not effective. It's not to say that they won't work. It's just to say, there's not the highest, that there are other approaches with higher evidence behind them in affecting positive changes in childhood apraxia speech. So with that being said, I'm going to talk to you about my own daughter, who's 10 now, with resolving apraxia. But when she was younger, I did put her in, I did put her in with a speech therapist who only used the Kaufman method. And at the time where she was pre-verbal, in that pre-verbal stage, Kaufman was amazing. This approach was amazing for her. And it really did bridge that gap between verbal or pre-verbal and verbal. And so, within the 9 months that I had her with this particular therapist, she really did go from, like I said, go from pre-verbal to being able to be verbal and say more things and have verbal communication, which was huge. Unfortunately, there after about 9 months, the therapist kind of just was very stuck though in this particular method. And as a speech language pathologist, I could recognize that my daughter was moving past these stages and that she essentially was outgrowing Kaufman. And I did talk to the speech therapist about, potentially changing the therapy approach up to better fit her now that she had been making so much progress. But this therapist really, and this isn't to bash the therapist, it's just that she was very stuck in remediating everything using the Kaufman method. So after 9 months, I switched her to a speech therapist who was better versed in kind of language disorders, and we used a phonological approach using the principles of motor learning. So it's just, very, very important that you not get stuck in one method just because it did work. The treatment plan is fluid and changes over time as the child improves. So, how does apraxia therapy differ from traditional therapy? So, this is another one I get asked a lot. I have had parents call or email me and tell me that how does the treatment approach change because they've approached their speech language pathologist and the speech and the SLP said it wouldn't change. The treatment approach doesn't change, but that is not true. So unless they were using an approach for apraxia already, which is highly unlikely because at least here in the United States, training at the graduate school level isn't very strong in childhood apraxia speech. It is for other speech sound disorders, but not this specifically. And so unless they obtain some sort of postgraduate education in it, it's very unlikely that they actually know these approaches we were talking about here and how to use them and treat it correctly. You're just not really taught these approaches in graduate school unless you were in a specific program that touched on these or you had an internship where your supervisor was using these. So anyway, so that's why it's really important to delineate that apraxia therapy does differ from traditional therapy, including phonological disorder, which is what we're usually treating. If you have a child with a severe speech sound disorder, we're usually looking at the difference between possible apraxia or phonological disorders. So how does it differ? In one word, movement. So therapy for apraxia should be focusing on the movement. Co-articulation, which is a term meaning the movement between the sounds, is the focus as opposed to just articulation, which is the sound production. So you might have noticed with your child or client that they can say many sounds, but they are unable to combine them, or they can say a and they can say an ah, but they can't put them together to say ma. So that is really the core of the deficit here, is in the movement needed to put those sounds together. So target selection does not necessarily follow developmental norms for that reason. So, I could give you an example with my daughter. She had an S, so SH is what we would consider in my world a typically later developing sound. So SH is shh, and she could not say mama, but she could say shoe. And so shoe was a target because, we're not really thinking about developmental norms. So we worked right away on getting, shoe and then other words, including her own name, which is Ashlyn. We knew she had an SH, so then we could go Ash and try and get that first part of her name. So, we weren't really stuck on the fact that she couldn't say these other sounds that tend to follow typical developmental norms and try and get those sounds in. We're focused on the sounds that she has and her being able to plan and program the movements to put those sounds together. So they should take into account the sound repertoire, as I mentioned. So that just means what are all the sounds that the child can currently say. They should take into account stimulability. Perhaps a child isn't really saying these sounds spontaneously, but if you, try to elicit the sounds, they are stimulable for them. So that's important because we want to be working on, what they're also stimulable for. And functionality. So functionality are words that, are very motivating for the child to use. So sometimes those don't follow developmental norms either. And in terms of functionality, we're also talking about prosody. So prosody is in terms of functionality, we can also work on prosody in that way. So I haven't talked about much prosody here, but prosody is one of the third criteria in getting a diagnosis of apraxia. And with prosody, this could include, usually what we're looking at is syllabic stress. So in English, if I have a word like banana, the stress is on that middle syllable. So banana, banana, instead of banana. So a lot of times we see children with apraxia struggling with that kind of stress pattern within multisyllabic words, but it can also include, speaking loud, speaking soft, varying their volume, their pitch, their intonation. And so we can work on all of those right away, because we actually do use our voice in different ways also to communicate. So, upward inflection of ma, meaning like, mom, I have a question, as opposed to ma, be conveyed through our prosody, and we can work on those things right away too, when we're planning target selection. So the commonalities in these approaches, I'm going to go back up here. So the commonalities in these approaches are, we are using principles of motor learning, as you learned about with Dr. Moss. And as I said, see his presentation for full details. I'm not going to go into the specific kind of practice schedules that we use with this, but um, his presentation is excellent for that, and is honestly the gold standard that everyone should really read and study first, before diving into even an approach, in my opinion. So cueing to help plan and program the movements. So we're going to talk about cueing a little later, and feedback. Knowledge of results versus knowledge of performance, we're going to talk about that later too. So we will touch on all of those, but this is these are what you want to be seeing in an approach for childhood apraxia of speech. So there are some precursors to any of these approaches, and they're very important. One is we have to have a relationship with the child. So, especially now in these days of telehealth, but certainly even in person, we can't just jump into the hard nitty-gritty work of direct therapy when the child doesn't know you. And so, therapy needs to be fun. We really should be trying to incorporate the child's interest and find that common ground. And I saw this in a presentation once, and I can't remember who said it, but it always stuck with me. And she said, ask yourself, would you want to work with you? And so I found that very telling. And, so I try to do that too, because if you watch Dr. Moss's presentation, you know that before we start motor learning, principles of motor learning, we have to inspire motivation. So a lot of times I have kids come to me who have been burned, and they had a therapist that didn't help them, and they have no reason to trust me. And so I have to give them not only reason to trust me, which means they show them that I can really help them, but I want to be fun, and I want to have a relationship with them, and so that we can build on that. So you really do need that trusting relationship. It has to be earned. I always say, trust is earned. It isn't just given. And that relationship is key, and motivation is key. And I tell everyone, all my interns that work with me, I tell them that we've got to be reading the child's emotional cues, because if we shut them down emotionally, if you have a child just crying through therapy or crying before they even walk in your door, that's not a place that anyone can work from, including adults. We can't, work hard and think correctly when we're in that state of, that poor emotional state. So reading the emotional cues, very important, and inspiring motivation. So once we have that, once we have the relationship, we have motivation, now we're going to really dive in and look at target selection. So a lot of people want to know, that kind of goes back to the beginning where it was like, where do I start? So now we know the approach we're probably going to use. They've been assessed. We know they have apraxia. And so, there's not an easy answer for this. There's not just a black and white answer, because the number of targets and target syllables or words are going to be dependent on the severity of the child. So it would make sense that we're going to have fewer targets or syllables or words, targets meaning syllables or words, for more severe children, and potentially we might be able to have more targets for less severe children who are able to handle that load. So with either way, whether you have fewer targets or more targets, the research is pretty clear that practice sets should still be small, even for less severe children. I usually do somewhere between 5 to 20, targets, depending at first, depending on severity. But, you know, again, I might not even be working, let's say if I have a practice set of 10, I might not even be working on all 10 during a session. Sometimes I need to do less targets just to get that acquisition of the sound patterns. What sequences? So sequences, referring to syllables here. You're going to develop target words from the current sound repertoire. So again, we're taking what are all the sounds that the child can say, and what are sounds that they're stimulable for saying. Um, and we're going to add sounds, add to the sound repertoire by probing for sounds and incorporating them into the target sets. And we're going to avoid working on sounds in isolation. This is something that got a lot of attention on my Instagram, because a lot of therapists will do this. They'll work on sounds by themselves. And what this means is we're not using another vowel with it. So we're just working on ba, 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 ba the whole session, as opposed to boo, bay, bee, which would be considered a sequence because we're combining it with another vowel. So the primary focus should be on the syllable level. And therapy for apraxia involves a different perspective. So usually SLPs are focused on sounds and patterns of sounds. You know, when we're dealing with an articulation disorder or a phonological disorder, we're very focused on just the sounds or trying to get new sounds that aren't there, on the patterns of sounds or trying to get new sounds that aren't there yet. Therapy for apraxia, conversely, targets the current sounds. So when I have kids come to me, I see so many goals around getting new sounds when so much work could still be done just targeting the current sounds that the child can say and getting them sequenced appropriately in their spontaneous speech. So, you know, they might not be able to say, you know, they have an M, but they can't say mama consistently. And the therapist is working on trying to get K or G. Step back and we're gonna, you know, again, focus on, it's one thing to probe and incorporate sounds that are stimulable. It's another thing to be actively trying to acquire new sounds when the sounds that we have, we don't even have sequenced correctly yet in the child's motor plan. So I found too in my practice that as the child gains control of his speech motor system with the current sounds that they have, many times new sounds start to come in. So, you know, one good example I have is a client, and he, you know, came to me and we were really working on um, the sounds that he had, and then which were like BPM, TD, and N. And then once he started gaining control over those sounds, moms started reporting, oh my gosh, he can say S now in this specific word, or he can say SH now in this specific word. And so, you know, once I hear that they've heard that, we throw it into the list, you know, and come up with a target word that incorporates that sound that is functional, motivating to the child, and can be incorporated throughout the day. So, um, I really, and in my own daughter too, I can give an example of her too. Um, uh, she, you know, could not say a K or a G until she was 4, and that was after she had gained control over what we call bilabials and alveolars. And once she was able to get control over those, one night she was able to say K. So at the end of book, instead of mama read a book, she told me mama read a book. And the minute I heard that K sound, we threw it into the target word list. Book became the target, and we practiced getting that K then into her speech. So another thing to keep in mind that I think is important when we're working on the sequences of sounds is that with apraxia, it doesn't really follow any rules on what's going to be easier for the child to say. So I've seen some children find it easier to produce a K, for example, at the end of a word. So as in book, you know, so book, and then they can take their time and say it. But I've also found kids who can just say it randomly in a highly motivating word that they just learned how to say, like maybe car, the boy who loves to play with cars. It finds it harder to say it at the end of a word like book. It still says but. So we can build on the word position that they have. And then from there, work to get the sounds in other words in other positions. So again, though, primary focus, most important thing is that we're working at the syllable level, and I'm not just working on k, but I'm actively trying to put it in a syllable or a word. So what syllables then? What syllables and words are you trying to put it in? Well, this depends on the severity. Again, well, this is also dependent. So it depends on the severity and type the child has. Um, but what is important is that we advance to new syllable shapes as well as increasing the number of syllable shapes as soon as possible. So, um, basically what I can say with this is, um, I might have a child who uh, finds it very difficult to say a two-syllable word like, teddy in teddy bear. But they're kind of at that one-syllable level where they could say tea, toe, or me, or D even. So, that's where we have to start. We have to meet the child where they're at, If they are, though, at a two, yeah, need to advance to new syllable shapes as well as increasing the number of syllable shapes ASAP. What kind of words then? So words need to be functional, functional, functional. And what does it mean, functional? It means words and functions the child wants to communicate. So, if you're working on a word that they don't care about, it's not going to be motivating, and they're not as likely to transfer it to their spontaneous speech. So we want it to be a highly motivating word that is of interest to the child. And so a lot of times I look for pet names and see if I can fit them into a target word list. Grandparents, what they call their grandparents, what they call mom and dad, friends, their favorite toys, and see if we can get appropriate target words, but using some things that they're interested in. So being strategic in the word list is important when the child masters each word and is ready to combine them. So we're also, targets should incorporate all the sounds in the child's repertoire, attempting varying syllable shapes and word positions. So should try to incorporate different communicative functions as well. Children have all of us have different reasons for communicating, and we're trying to build their communication skills as much as we are improving their speech production. So we want to be looking at commenting, requesting, rejecting, greetings. So a target word list that I might have for a client might include, simple words in English, like hi and bye, which are nice consonant vowel words. And then also um, along with a person. So mama, dada, oma if it's a grandma or someone like that. So then once we master mama and once we master hi, we're still not done with that word list. Now we're combining them, hi, mama. Rejecting would be no, don't in English. We get creative with the words that we use sometimes. And then greetings again, like hi or bye. So um, yeah, so this could also include, just different even functions of words, such as verbs and nouns, because then we're strategic in combining them. So then I can say, no, mama, or yeah. All right. So potential target words review. Think words already in their repertoire. So what words can they already say? And this is important because, a lot of times children with apraxia can say a word just kind of spontaneously without any help. But then when you ask them, let's say they can say mama, but then when you say, I had a child I can just recently, she could say dada, and she said it spontaneously. But when I said, who's this? Say dada, she couldn't do it. So that's another important distinction with apraxia. Sometimes they don't know how they made those sounds, and we have a starting point to get them to say it from words they already have in their repertoire. So those words could go on the word list. Think sounds already in their repertoire. So we talked about that. What are sounds that you've heard them say? Like my daughter saying "sh" and loving shoes, but then being able to transfer that to Ash to get her to be able to say her name Ash. Think functional. Shoe, she loved shoes. That might not be motivating to a boy who doesn't like shoes. Ash, certainly, her name was motivating and very functional, a child's name, um, but also communicative intent. So, does the child have a way to reject something and say no? Do they have a way to request? Can they call the people that they love their names, or their pets? Can they say their names? So, all of those things go into it when we're thinking functional. Are we incorporating the current syllable shapes in the child's repertoire? Are we working at their level, essentially? We're not choosing words like bunny, which is longer, or banana in English, when they can't even say eat. So what's the better bang for the buck, banana or eat? So amount of targets, again, are going to vary on severity, lower for more severe, more for less severe. And as a general rule, just what I do is usually practice sets or target word lists of between 5 and 20. Sometimes, though, I might have children who are considered less severe. They're just not acquiring the words in the time frame, or the target words in the time frame that I think that they need to. And so in that case, I lower the practice set and we focus maybe on 5, and really just making sure that we get those words with math practice so we can get acquisition into the motor plan. Types of syllable shapes, again, I think I've already kind of touched on that, depend on severity and what the child currently has. So, it is it's dynamic for that reason. There's not just a practice word list you can come up with for um, any child with apraxia. It's also individual. It is so individual, and that's why the set programs like Kaufman have to be kind of used with caution, because there isn't just a set word list that kids can say, and those words might not be motivating to the child. So that's important. I do want to say too, I think that, I do want to talk about principles of motor learning. If you watch Dr. Moss, you know that we have what's called mass practice. Um, and mass practice is very important, as I was just mentioning, for acquisition. So acquisition means, yes, now the child can say the word correctly, and we can get them there. But the problem is, and if you're a parent with a child with apraxia, I think this was the most eye-opening thing for me as a speech language pathologist, was that even though my daughter could say things in the therapy session, when we got home, she didn't transfer it. So, I write in my book that, she could say mama in therapy. And I assumed that was it. I was like, yes, we have mama. She's going to say mama now. And, we get home and there's no mama, so it was like, why don't we have that transfer? And the reason lies in the, definition of what apraxia is, which is a motor learning deficit. And in motor learning, it's not enough to have acquisition in a structured setting. We have to have distributed practice, which allows for what we call generalization. And so parents are actually the greatest help um, to work on that distributed practice piece. And so, having a target word list for Ashlyn, I would have been working on, I was not at that time, but, working on those target words that can be incorporated throughout the day are also really functional. So, a lot of favorites of mine that tend to be simple syllable shapes in English include words, verbs like eat or go. And then in that sense, I can combine them, and the parent can easily incorporate, eat, out, or go throughout their whole day. And when the parent is able to focus on words like that throughout their whole day, we really get that distributed practice piece in, and that's where you get generalization and carryover of the words. So Parents are very important and do and can play an integral part in therapy for apraxia, as long as we're also, being very mindful of picking words that, are functional and can be incorporated throughout their day as well. It actually surprises a lot of people. I never had sit down practice as an SLP with my daughter. And as I've met more speech language pathologists who also have children with apraxia now that I've been in this journey, they didn't either. The best practice occurred with words that were more frequent and that could be used and incorporated throughout the child's day. And then we worked on them just all day long, as opposed to sitting down in a very finite amount of time and drilling target words. So not to say that the drill isn't bad either, because we do want, acquisition, but distributed practice, so important too. All right, so I'm going to get into cueing real quick. Cueing is an important aspect of therapy for apraxia, and in fact, it's essential. I didn't do a lot of cueing before I learned how to do therapy for apraxia. I'd seen some therapists do some cueing. I didn't realize how much it's needed. And why is it needed for apraxia? The most important reason is because it provides a way to help the brain plan and program the movements for speech. So every time someone's kind of, we come up with, oh, apraxia is a motor planning problem. Well, how do we fix that? And how we fix it is we're going to use things like cueing. So there are various types of cueing, including verbal, visual, tactile. Examples of some verbal cues is I would do from a colleague of mine, and he attached names to sounds. So, M was the humming, M is the humming sound. D in my practice is the drumming sound. I can type it. And so what we can do with verbal cues then is it's very helpful. We can use them to not only cue, but we can use it for feedback. So let's say I have a child say E for me. I can tell them, oh, use your humming sound. And they have equated now humming sound with and use our humming sound to say the word me. So that can be one way of cueing. I actually like this a lot for kids who have a very hard time paying attention to my face. Some kids just have a lot of difficulty looking at my face, even though it's so important that they do. And so if they can't, I do find verbal cues to be very helpful because they don't have to look, but they can remember, oh yeah, humming sound, oh yeah, drumming sound, dip. So those are some example of verbal cues taken from the great, now retired David Hammer. And then example of visual cues. So visual cues would include things like watching my face, definitely. So when we're talking DTTC with that specific approach, we really want the child attending to our face. And we're going to be, that is a cue, because by watching your mouth, we're really firing up these mirror neurons to imitate what they're seeing. And so it's just very helpful. So even watching the face is a visual cue. Finger cues, Kaufman has these in her book. I've kind of adopted my own. Finger cues could be if I'm having the word say bubble, having them say the word bubble, I'm going to say, use your bubble sound and say bubble, bubble. So I'm cueing the buzz there, bubble. Other finger cues I have would be like T for T or K. And so it's just a different place on the face or a different finger movement that I put on my face. It's not used on the child's face to cue them of where they're going to go with that sound. So I find those really helpful. There's picture cue, and then there are picture cues. So you might be familiar with maybe Bjorm, Linda Mood-Bell, and others. Bjorm also includes, actually I have she includes the first one I have here is popcorn. And so she has the visual cue here. So you might just tell the child, oh, what do we say? And this is their visual cue. But she also has words on the back that are a verbal cue. So she calls it the popcorn sound and then has them popcorn. So instead of on the face, I might say your popcorn sound and go, which is my visual cue, finger cue for P. You can also do it this way, which is a visual picture cue for P, and get them to say the word pop. So anyway, I always tell everyone, there's nothing magical about, although Jenny is amazing, there's nothing magical about her cues. There's nothing magical about my cues. There's nothing magical about anyone's cues. The magic in the cues lies in the child recognizing what the cues mean. So it has to be meaningful to the child. You know, I can give you an example. Um, just recently, I have a kid who was having a difficult time making a H sound in English. And, um, you know, we went through a lot of different words. We went through, I usually call it the breathy sound. That's kind of my usual, typical verbal cue for it. But that wasn't working. So we tried Bjorum's cue, and she calls it the hot dog sound because dogs, when they're hot, go, and it kind of worked. It was working better than breathy sound. But then we figured out that if we called it the yawning sound, which yawning in English is going at the yawn. So if we called it the yawning sound, now the child was just magically going because he equated yawning with that sound. So really, there's nothing magical about anyone's cue. The magic lies in that the cue makes sense and is meaningful to the child. Here's an example of me doing just a quick finger cue for go. I'm cueing duck here in go, and I'm using what's called the pause technique. In this video, I called it a close procedure, but essentially it's just where we stop before the target word that we are trying to elicit. So take a look, and this is on my Instagram. And so I try to post videos there when I can of different examples. So there you can see just I'm using the finger cue to, and I had faded. I usually do both. I usually do verbal and visual cues together. And you can see here that I had faded all my verbal cues for the most part. And I'm just doing this finger cue to remind him to make the G sound for go. So a note on cueing here, though cues are essential for helping the child with the planning and programming component, for true motor learning or retention to occur, cues need to be faded. And so this is actually very tricky. I see kids sometimes who come to me who have made flatlined in therapy, and the parents report that they were making so much progress, but then seem to have kind of just hit this plateau. And though that does happen, sometimes it's because the child has just become cue dependent. And so they made all this progress in therapy, but it was just like I was talking about with distributed practice being so important for carryover and generalization. We haven't faded the cues, and it hasn't been, generalized to their spontaneous speech. So, parents can really get good at cueing, which is helpful. But this is why it's so important to have a speech language pathologist there running the treatment plan, because the cues have got to be faded eventually for the motor learning and or retention to occur. So really, I kind of refer to it as like a dance of providing and pulling away cues in order to help the child acquire independent acquisition of the targets. So yeah, I'm gonna put dance in here. So if you're familiar with the movie Frozen, Elsa sings a song that says, "Let it go," and that's kind of how I feel about cueing. It's this dance between providing the cues and letting it go. So these are, we have to be able to do these. Otherwise, independence is unlikely ever to be reached. So very important. The other piece that I do want to mention is feedback. Feedback is also so helpful, and it's one of the things that parents can easily incorporate into their everyday. And it helps even just teach the child some of the cues sometimes. So there's two types of feedback in principles of motor learning. We have knowledge of results and knowledge of performance. And so with these knowledge of results, this is information provided after completion of the target that compares the outcome to the target. So really, results were just kind of saying, no, or yes, or good job, or not quite. But we're not really giving them a lot of information on why it was good or why it was not quite good. So initially, we want to be using a lot of feedback that falls in the category of knowledge of performance. So knowledge of performance relates to the nature or quality of the movement, specific to what the child did. So, instead of just saying not quite, I'm going to say, oh, close your lips for that humming sound, or round your lips for that ooh, or let me hear ooh lips. Or I didn't hear your ooh lips, something like that. Or I saw your mouth was open, I need it closed. Those things are really going to help the child's brain plan and program again, and adjust, hopefully, to try and adjust the movement that they did. So um, this is just, parents can even do this to, and it's really helpful, just to tell the child what they did, like, oh, I heard your coughing sound. You just, my daughter, for example, when she said book, for the first time instead of but, I would say, oh, you just said in book, you just did a coughing sound, do it again, book. And we can give them that feedback to even teach them then the cues that we're going to use to help get it again. So um, and these two both though are needed. So you're really going to be relying more on knowledge of performance at the beginning in kind of that acquisition stage, and moving to knowledge of results as the child gets better, and you don't need to use quite as much cueing. So definitely again, this is like kind of another dance where I'm using both. So I have a video example if there's time, but if there's not, um, yeah, how long have I been going here? I'm gonna stop share.